Alright, and begin. Welcome to the cardiac rehab diet portion of our education class. Today I will be talking about the heart healthy diet. And my name is Anna Hambright and I am the dietitian for the cardiac rehab program. So some of the things that we will go over today are the risk factors for heart disease, the two main components of the heart healthy diet, and then some general rules to live by to have a heart healthy diet. So you've probably seen these. These are the risk factors for heart disease. But I just wanted to highlight a few of them. Overweight and obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and excessive alcohol consumption are all diet related, meaning diets directly related to improving these risk factors or making them worse. So that's about half of these risk factors for heart disease. So that's why we're spending half of this class talking about the importance of a heart healthy diet. So I just want to touch on weight. Cardiac rehab is not a weight loss class by any means, but if you do need to lose weight to move to a healthier weight, losing 5 to 10 pounds can help reduce your risk factors by 1 to 2%. And so here you can see in the pictures, we're more concerned about the weight above the waist or the apple shape. This is the visceral adiposity, or your fat cells that push on your internal organs. So this is the weight that we're more worried about compared to, say, the pear shape when you carry your weight below your waist. We will be monitoring your weight at cardiac rehab, and you're probably been recommended to weigh yourself at home as well, because drastic changes, more than 5 pounds in 2 days, will usually signal something else is happening. And hopefully by adapting healthier diet, healthier activity, you will move towards a healthier weight for you. Alright, so let's get into the heart healthy diet. What is it? So this is the slide that shows all of the guidelines for it. So it focuses on two main things, limiting fat and limiting sodium. And we'll go into each of these in more detail. So with limiting fat, we want to limit the total calories from fat to less than 30% per day. And we really want to focus on saturated fat to less than 7% of our daily calories, which is about 15 to 20 grams for most people. Then we also want to eliminate trans fats. For sodium, the guideline is less than 2,000 milligrams per day. And then the rest of the diet is just an overall helpful diet. Lots of fruits and vegetables, trying to have fish a few times a week. At least make half your servings of grains, whole grains, and limit sugar-sweetened beverages and those sugary sweets. So we'll start with the fat. We call it the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we're watching saturated fat, limiting saturated fat. And one of the reasons why we're limiting saturated fat is because that is what's linked to causing the plaque buildup in your arteries. So when you're looking at this screen, and you start on the left-hand side, it's a nice open vessel, meaning your arteries can expand and contract to whatever blood flow you need. But as you move over to the right, you can see that plaque buildup inside the artery. And this is doing two things. It's narrowing the opening of your artery, and then it also makes the artery not as flexible. It's kind of rigid. And so that's where you can get a stent or you can have a heart attack when this occurs, but this is what we're trying to prevent from limiting our saturated fat. So our saturated fat, again, think about this as fats that are solid at room temperature versus liquid at room temperature. So we're limiting our saturated fats or our solid fats to less than 7% of our calories per day, so about 15 to 20 grams. So if it's a solid fat, mostly these come from animal-based products. So any fat you find on an animal or a piece of meat or something that comes from an animal will be a source of saturated fat. So think about the fat on the outside of like the pork chop or on the bacon. You can see that fat. That would be saturated fat. And then of course with the animals, different animals have different percent of saturated fat. So red meat has the most saturated fat by nature, Pork's middle of the road. Chicken and turkey are leaner. So that's why you hear limit red meat, because it naturally has more saturated fat in it. Then we're also worried about things that come from animals, so our dairy products. Dairy fat is also considered a saturated fat. So trying to do lower fat dairy would be recommended. And then there are two sources of saturated fat that don't come from an animal. These are our coconut oil and our palm kernel oil. Palm kernel oil is used in a lot of our processed foods, so we're wanting to limit those processed foods. And then coconut oil is found in those as well, but it has become more popular in recent history. But if you've ever seen it in the store, a jar of coconut oil is solid, a solid white jar of fat. So if it's solid at room temperature, that means it's highly saturated. So we want to treat it like any of our other saturated fats and limit it during the day. Other fats that we're trying to eliminate would be those trans fats or hydrogenated oils. These are man-made fats. They are formed when they take a liquid fat, pump it full of a bunch of hydrogen, to hydrogenate it to make it solid at room temperature. So they use it in processed foods mainly because it's shelf stable, it's cheap, but when we consume these hydrogenated oils or the trans fats, these little hydrogen molecules break off and cause inflammation and damage throughout our body. They become things called free radicals. So it's the one thing everyone can agree upon that we do not want in our system. So these are what we're trying to eliminate. A classic example of a trans fat would be Crisco. So we reviewed the solid fats that we're trying to limit, but we do need fats in our diet. At least a third of our diet should be coming from fat sources. We just want them to be good and healthy fat sources. So these would be the fats that are liquid at room temperature. So think about our oils. So they are considered mono and polyunsaturated fats are the technical terms. Sometimes we can refer to them as omega-3s or omega-6s, but they are mostly like our oils. Other sources would be our avocados, our nuts, our seeds, and our fatty fishes would all be sources of this good fats that we want, the unsaturated fats. I do highlight out peanut butter under the good list because peanut butter is a nut, so it's a good healthy fat. But sometimes with peanut butter, they take out the peanut oil and add in palm kernel oil, which is a saturated fat. That's how peanut butter doesn't separate on the shelf. So they took a good fat and added a bad fat, so then it becomes one of the foods you have to limit. So if you eat peanut butter, I would recommend trying to do the natural kind that separates. That's what you're looking for, things that don't have that added saturated fat in there, because it doesn't need to be there. So other sources of our saturated fat that we've already talked about would be our meats, and different cuts of meats are fattier than others. So think about the loins, that's the leaner cuts. And then also our cream, our cheeses, our butter, fatty meals, chocolate. So chocolate can be heart healthy if done in moderation, if done with dark chocolate. But a lot of the times with chocolate we add butter and milk and sugar and everything to it, so it can become a source of saturated fat for us. And then also prepared foods tend to be really high in saturated fat. Other sources of the trans fats that we're trying to eliminate would be, as I discussed earlier, the shortening. Fried foods tend to be fried in a trans fat. Coffee creamers, that's the kind of hidden one. A lot of times those coffee creamers can be sources of trans fat, so we want to check the labels for those. So anytime you see the word hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oil on an ingredient list, that means it's a source of trans fats. And then pre-made cookies and sweets can also be some sources of trans fats because they're usually made with the shortening in the store. So that is the overview of the fats that we're trying to limit and the ones that we're trying to promote. The other big part of the diet is sodium. So we're trying to limit sodium to less than 2,000 milligrams per day. One of the easiest ways to think about sodium is that water follows salt. So in this picture, the little gray molecules are sodium molecules and the blue ones are water. So the more salt that you eat, the more sodium you'll have in your blood, which means more water will flow in to neutralize it. So this is doing a few things. It's increasing your blood volume, and then that means that your arteries have to expand to accommodate the new volume, and then it makes your heart work harder to pump this all through. So if your heart's not working the greatest or you're not pumping it all out, it can start to pool, and so that's why sometimes some people get edema or water retention in their ankles. More worrisome is when it's around your lungs and your heart. So this is where you'll get put on a water pill or so. So where does all this sodium come from? So we recommend limiting it to less than 2,000 milligrams a day. The average American eats between 3,600 and 4,000 milligrams per day. And the majority of this is coming from processed foods and restaurant foods. As you can see on the pie chart, 77% of our sodium intake is from processed food and restaurant food. The rest of it is naturally occurring, added while eating, so like the salt shaker, and then of course what you add yourself when you're cooking at home. So if you're really trying to make a change to your salt intake in your diet, you want to target this blue piece of the pie. So trying to decrease those processed foods and restaurant foods. And I keep referring to sodium in milligrams, recommending less than 2,000 milligrams per day. But to put that in more of daily terms, that would be a quarter teaspoon of table salt has approximately 600 milligrams of sodium. So overall, we are wanting less than a teaspoon of salt in all of our diet throughout the day. So it really is not that much. But if you are an average American and you think that you're averaging 3,600 to 4,000 milligrams per day, to put that in perspective, over the course of the year, you would have consumed 7 containers of Morton salt. So it adds up pretty quickly. And where it comes from, majority is that processed food. So I'm just going to run through that so we can get a perspective of how much sodium we're actually consuming every day. So a big source of sodium is canned foods. Think about canned vegetables, canned beans, canned tomatoes, and soup. So here is an example of canned green beans. So this one can of green beans has 1,190 milligrams of sodium. Over half your daily value of sodium in one can of green beans. Other big sources are frozen food. So this is not frozen vegetables or frozen fruit, but all other frozen foods like the entrees and the pre-made appetizers, things such as that. So here's an example of a banquet frozen dinner. This one dinner contains over 1,000 milligrams of sodium. So again, over half your daily allowance in one meal. Of course, with frozen dinners, they can actually incorporate into a heart-healthy diet if you choose correctly, but typically they're a lot higher than this example. So if anyone's ever had like a frozen pot pie from Marie Callender's, one of those pot pies has almost like 3,000 milligrams of sodium in it. So it adds up pretty quickly. Snack foods is another big source of sodium for us. So think about snack foods as pretzels, crackers, chips, popcorn, things like that. So they tend to be salty already. And then, for example, this is 9 pretzels for 490 milligrams. So the issue with that is that's a quarter of your daily allowance almost for 9 pretzels. But are you counting out 9 pretzels? Probably not. You're probably just grabbing and going, as we mostly are. And then also pretzels and snack foods typically aren't part of your daily value or part of a meal. So they're just kind of adding up quickly. Other things that are big sources of sodium are packaged starchy foods. So think about any of those kind of starchy noodles, ramen noodles, these rice dishes, pasta dishes that have that seasoning packet in there. So if you were to make red beans and rice at home from scratch, you can control how much sodium, but instead here 1 cup has 1190 milligrams. And then instant cooking food is another example of high sodium foods that we can purchase at the grocery store. So 1 cup of these instant mashed potatoes is 560 milligrams. Again, if you were to make potatoes or mashed potatoes at home, it would not have nearly as much sodium in it. So the more convenient something is, usually the higher in sodium it becomes. Other sources of sodium are mixes. So our cornbread mixes, bread mixes, things such as that. Things we don't typically think about being a big source of sodium for us, but we want to be aware of. Also meats and cheeses. So we touched a little bit about meats and cheeses being high in saturated fat, but they can also be high in sodium. So cheese has sodium in it naturally, or dairy has sodium in it naturally, and as the cheese ages, it kind of concentrates the sodium content. So the more aged cheeses or the harder cheeses will be higher in sodium than the fresh young cheeses. So typically we say that the mozzarella and the fresh cheeses are lower in sodium and more heart-friendly than the other cheeses. The exception to that is processed cheese. So like Cheese Whiz and American cheese would both still be pretty high in sodium. With meat can become high in sodium based on how it is prepared. So anything that's cured would be high in sodium, or brined would be high in sodium. And again, this processed meat, from processing it into lunch meat, makes it higher in sodium. And then other sources of processed meats would be like our hot dogs or our sausages. Our breakfast meats tend to be high in sodium. Or canned meats like Vienna sausages or Spam will also be high in sodium. Of course, if you like deli meat, there are always better options to look for. So for example, if you get deli meat sliced off the bone from the counter, it would have less sodium than a deli meat that is in a container as shown. So there are always some different options you can find, but it's good to be aware of where your sodium's coming from. The next big source of sodium for us is restaurants. Restaurants tend to be really high in sodium and much higher than if you were to make it at home. This is just 1 bowl of soup from Olive Garden, has 1,020 milligrams of sodium in it. That doesn't include the breadsticks or the salad that might come with it. And again, fast food as well can be big sources of sodium, more so than you would think about if you were to make it at home, or you would assume that it would have. So these are all big sources of sodium in our diet, so that we can start learning how much we're consuming every day. And what we would look for to learn how much sodium or fat or what nutrients are in a food would be the food label. So there is a lot of information on this food label, so we'll just narrow in on a few sections. First, we want to pay attention to serving size and serving per container. Serving size does not always mean what you eat size. So a serving size, there might be 2 or 3 servings in the 1 bag of pretzels, but if you eat the whole bag, you need to say you ate 3 servings and do the calculations for the number below as appropriate. Then you want to pay attention to the fat section. So as you see on the screen, there's saturated fat and there's trans fats. So the saturated fat is what we're wanting less than 15 to 20 grams per day. And the trans fat's what we want none of. And you can kind of remember that we don't want any trans fats because at the end of its line, there's no % daily value because nobody wants it in their daily foods. The little caveat there is that if something has less than 0.5 grams or less per serving, it can be listed as 0 grams. So if you're worried about the trans fats, always read the food ingredients and look for any words that say hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated. And then the last section you want to look for a heart healthy diet would be the sodium. So it would say sodium, and then there would be milligrams next to it. So a general rule of thumb is a low sodium food has less than 140 milligrams per serving, while a high sodium food has more than 300 milligrams per serving. So you can kind of use that as a rough estimate as you're comparing different products. The last thing I just want to draw your attention to is the sugar line. This has been updated on the majority of our food labels since January to say includes X grams of added sugar, which is more what we're looking for than total sugars, those added sugars to foods. So there's a lot of information here, but it helps if we just narrow it down to what we want to look for and what we're limiting. So now that we have learned about what the heart healthy diet is, we're going to move into how we can apply this to our lives. And if you don't do anything else, the number one thing to work on would be to work on portion control. And we can do this in a lot of different ways. We can use this plate as shown from choosemyplate.gov. This is our food model. And as you can see, half the plate is fruits and vegetables. If you make half your plate fruits and vegetables, that leaves less room for grains and protein, which tend to be the food groups that might be a little bit higher in our salt or a little bit higher in our saturated fat. You can always work on portion control when you go out by splitting a meal or taking half of it home or ordering off the senior or kids menu to get a better portion for you. And the reason we want to talk about this is because we live in a time of portion distortion, meaning what we're served isn't what an actual portion is. Over time, our portions have got bigger and bigger and bigger. So as you see on the left is what a typical cheeseburger and french fry. And then on the right is what an actual serving of cheeseburger and french fry should be. Now this does not mean that a heart patient should go out and eat a half-pound cheeseburger and french fries, but it's to demonstrate that even if we're served it, it's still too big of a portion for us. And if we just ate the right portion or a proper serving, as demonstrated on the right, we would automatically eat less calories, less grams of fat, and less sodium. So this is another good example of this, of portion distortion. So there are 2 movie theaters, and they each received popcorn. One movie theater received a normal size serving of popcorn, while the other one received the jumbo collector bucket size of popcorn. And the moviegoers were told, you can have all the popcorn that you want. All you have to do is take the survey at the end. And the survey asked if you needed refills, if you were satisfied, and was that a good serving size. And the results from both theaters came back exactly the same. They said, nope, that was a perfect serving size, I was completely satisfied, I didn't need any refills. But the people who had the jumbo size popcorn ate 500 calories more. And they just ate that because that's what they were served. So we're trying to pay more attention to what proper servings are and not letting the plate or what we're served be dictating how much we're eating. So trying to pay attention to portions and portion distortion. And now we'll go through some other ways and other tips to help follow a heart-healthy lifestyle. And the one thing that you can always do is eat at least one fruit or vegetable at every meal, and I'll add every snack. Fruits and vegetables are naturally low in fat and sodium, super high in all our vitamins and minerals, and then they have extra things in them, such as bioactive compounds and phytochemicals. So these are the little extras in foods that help protect them from the environment, but also when we eat the foods and we eat these phytochemicals, they give us extra protection as well. So an example of this is like when we have blueberries, they have antioxidant powers in them. So That's from that blue color. So each of the different colors has a little bit of a different function. So I always like to highlight the red ones with the lycopene in them. Lycopene can help decrease the inflammation of the cardiovascular system. And since heart disease is an inflammatory process, it's good to include some red foods in your diet. Green can be really good for your digestive health. And then, of course, we have all of our berries with those antioxidants. So even though you might have to limit some vegetables, say if you're on Coumadin and you have to limit vitamin K foods, please still try to choose a variety of the different colors to incorporate into your diet. We always say, eat the rainbow. The next thing you can start doing to adapt to a heart-healthy lifestyle is purchasing no salt added canned foods. For example, this green bean can went from 1190 milligrams down to 35 milligrams, and that's without changing anything about the serving size. Of course, you can also choose frozen vegetables, which would be preferred as they're frozen at their peak nutritional value with no salt added, but these canned options are great too. If you have a lot of canned foods in your pantry right now, a good option to do is just to drain them and then rinse them really well before you can consume them. This has shown to decrease the sodium content of the food by about 25%. Now there are a lot of different no salt added options out there. They're not always the easiest to find, but you just have to kind of look for them. As you can see, there's a lot of different vegetables and beans and tomato options. Soup is probably the hardest one to find as a no salt added version. This Healthy Valley Organics can usually be found at the health food store. Progresso, I know, is making a lower sodium line, but not a no salt added one yet. And I like to highlight too that the ketchup option to have a no salt added. The next tip I would like to share would be trying a Meatless Monday or trying a meatless meal per week, whatever day you choose. Now this is twofold. We're typically not getting enough vegetable servings in per day. We're trying to get 9 servings of fruits and vegetables in every day, which is quite a bit. And then also, the meat in our meals tends to be our highest source of our saturated fat. So if we decrease the saturated fat and increase the vegetables, it's a win-win situation. Now, we have a lot of different options out there. I just like to highlight a couple that I see. So there's one, it's called quinoa, Quinoa. It's a grain, so you can substitute this for a rice or a pasta that's in your meal. Quinoa is great because it's considered a complete protein, just as meat is. Other good things to try too would be lentils. Lentils are little similar to split peas. They're small little discs, and they're easy to cook, but unlike other legumes, you don't have to pre-soak them overnight, so they're quick cooking. And they're really high in protein as well. It can add a nice texture to your soup or your salads. Alright, and the next tip was try to change to skim or lower fat dairy products. So again, this is an example of eliminating, it's just switching from a full fat sour cream to a light sour cream. So it's gone from 5 grams of fat to 2.5 grams of fat, which is quite a bit. And that's not even switching your serving size of it. So if you decrease the serving size, or you could get crazy and switch from sour cream to Greek yogurt, but you're already saving yourself almost 2 grams of saturated fat. And this is the same example with milk. So going from a full fat milk or whole milk down to 1% saves almost 4 grams of saturated fat, which is quite a bit when we're considering that we only have 15 grams per day. And there are other options out there too. Yogurt's a great option for choosing lower fat milks for. Mozzarella is a natural fat cheese as it's made with a 2% instead of a whole milk. They make other reduced fat cheeses out there like reduced fat cheddar or something similar to that. but they can have a different texture and flavor to them. So if you're a big cheese fan, just trying to limit and controlling your portion of cheese will be your best bet. The next tip is to spice up your meals. Use spices and herbs to add flavorings to your meals. Just because you're limiting how much salt or sodium you're using doesn't mean your food has to be bland. Maybe try some new cuisines like Indian or Thai. These are two cuisines that have a really strong flavor profile. So meaning using different herbs and spices so that you don't miss the salt. Cumin, chili, turmeric, whatever you choose, you can use as much as you would like, as long as it's not a salt, a garlic salt, an onion salt, pink Himalayan salt. Those are all things that we're still trying to limit to less than that 2,000 milligrams per day. We also want to avoid salt substitutes. These are things that instead of a sodium chloride molecule, which is what salt is, it replaces the sodium with a potassium. So it's a potassium chloride molecule. The reason we're not huge fans of these is that the potassium chloride, or the salt form of the potassium, can interact with some of your cardiac medications. So we are not wanting those. And they kind of taste funny. So examples of these salt substitutes would be new salt, low salt, or no salt. These are different than salt-free seasonings. So Mrs. Dash, McCormick makes in a pinch example. So those are salt-free seasonings. So don't be afraid to spice up your meals. And then the last tip is try to know before you go. Because eating out is part of life, but we've learned earlier in the presentation that eating out in restaurant foods can be really high in sodium. So you can prepare yourself. You can look up the nutrition facts of your favorite restaurants before you go. If a restaurant has more than 20 locations within the United States, they're required to have nutrition facts online and also in the store. Of course, there's some third-party websites like livestrong.com or dietfacts.com that can also provide you with an estimation of how much your food or your meal choice will be. And so if you were to look up, like for Olive Garden, for example, you would just go to their website and look for any kind of tab that says nutrition or menu. And then, of course, again, more clicking, nutritional menu, and you'll get something similar to this. It's a big old spreadsheet of all the nutrition information for all of their meals. So this can be helpful so you can learn how much saturated fat you're having in that meal, or how much sodium you're having in that meal, so that maybe you can choose a better option for you, or at least you know that, and then you maybe can try to be a little bit better the rest of the day. And I always used to pick on Olive Garden as being super high in sodium, which it definitely is, but Texas Roadhouse is coming in a hot second. They tend to be really high in sodium as well. So if you were to go to the store, this is kind of what they would bring you as well. At more fast food, more convenient places, it's a similar process. But the nutrition guide kind of looks like this. It's like a pamphlet or so. Sometimes they also have this on the menu or the back of the tray liner. Or like for Chipotle, it's on the back of the menu when you walk in and you pull that little tab. So it's always available. You just have to kind of look for it. But if you don't want to look for it, there's two things that you can do. As always, skip the chips and say no to the dough. So thinking about skipping this pre-meal filler options. So for example, like tortilla chips. 13 chips can have about 7 grams of fat in them because they're fried. So that's almost half that daily allowance of saturated fat. Egg can be high in sodium as well, and you're probably not going just for the chips in the meal. So might as well save your allotment for the actual meal itself. Another example would be the Olive Garden breadstick. One breadstick has 400 milligrams of sodium. 400! So, and that's just in one. So if then you ate two, that's 800. So almost half your daily allowance of sodium in 2 breadsticks. So might as well just skip it completely. Then when you're looking at menus, these are kind of the words you want to be drawn to. These are the types of cooking methods that tend to be healthier, meaning they don't add a lot of things to it. They're not as indulgent. So baked, boiled, broiled, grilled, lightly sauteed, poached, roasted, and steamed in its own juices. These are the better choices for you. Words that you tend to want to stay away from or not have as option often would be words like this: Alfredo, basted, breaded, butter sauce, casserole, cream sauce, cream, crispy, deep fried, gravy, hollandaise sauce, marinated in oil, or pot pie. These are a little more indulgent ways to prepare foods, so they tend to have more saturated fat in them, maybe a little more sodium. So we're trying to limit how often we have these types of dishes. So just to review those kind of general rules again would be to eat at least one fruit or vegetable at every meal and snack. Purchase no salt added canned foods. Consume turkey products over meat products. So think about choosing those leaner meats. Instead, doing more low-fat dairy products instead of full-fat. Try to spice up your meal, and knowing before you go. So think about looking up those restaurant facts before you head out to dine. And so today we have covered the risk factors for heart disease, the two main components of the heart healthy diet, and some general rules of heart health. So just as a closing note, just eat like your health depends on it, because it does. So thank you for watching our diet portion of this presentation.